How can you send production-grade emails in .NET without any headaches? In this video, I'll show you how you can use Amazon's simple email service to send emails from your .NET applications in just one line of code. It's fast, it's reliable, and most of all, it's production-ready. Let's dive in. Amazon SES, or Simple Email Service, is a managed cloud service that allows you to easily integrate email sending into any application. In this video, we're going to be dealing with how to integrate it into a .NET application. I also want to say a huge thank you to AWS, who is the sponsor of today's video, and if you want to get some free AWS credits, check out the pinned comment below this video. Now let me give you a high-level introduction to Amazon SES. Why should you consider Amazon's simple email service? First of all, it's ideal for sending high volumes of emails and doing it reliably. This could be transactional or marketing emails. It's ideal for most purposes, and actually Amazon SES is often the backbone of many popular email providers. You should definitely consider SES if you want to improve email deliverability. We're going to discuss what impacts deliverability later when we get to the practical part of this video. Another thing SES does for you is really simplifies email management, both from the AWS console and also in your code when it comes to actually having to send an email in just a couple of lines of code. Now, when it comes to the pricing, it's pay-as-you-go pricing, and it does fall under the AWS free tier, which gives you 3,000 free messages per month. And when you go above this limit, it costs just 10 cents per 1,000 outgoing or incoming emails. So it's definitely a very affordable service if you need to send a high volume of emails, and frankly, you're probably not going to find a better deal out there. Now let's jump into the AWS console and see how we can get started with Amazon's simple email service. From the AWS console, you want to navigate to the Amazon simple email service. You can find it by typing in SES, and let's go ahead and navigate there. We're going to be greeted with the account dashboard, and let me show you what you need to do in order to start sending your first emails. You have to go to configuration and then identities, and you need to define at least one identity. So I'm going to click create identity, and you have two options here. You can use a domain that you own, where you have to assign a couple of DNS records in your domain's DNS settings, and once those are verified, your domain is going to be activated in SES, and you can start sending emails using this domain or a subdomain. This is also the recommended approach if you want to get high deliverability and minimize the risks of your emails landing in the spam or junk folders. Now, if you just want to build a proof of concept, you can use an email address to verify ownership of the said address, and this is the example I'm going to demonstrate in this video. So all we have to do is enter an email address. I'm going to use a throwaway email address that I own for this example, and really that's all there is to it. So now I have to click create identity, and this is going to send a verification email to this inbox, where I need to click a verification link in order to confirm that I actually am the owner of this address. If I go into the inbox for this email, I can see the verification email from Amazon Web Services, and then here is the email verification link that I need to click to verify my email address. So let's go ahead and do that, and we're going to land on this page saying that we have successfully verified our email address. Now let's go back to the AWS console. If I go ahead and refresh the details for this email, you can see that the identity status is now verified, and I can start sending emails using this email address. So let's go ahead and send a test email to just confirm that this is working, and I'm going to send a formatted email using the same address as the from address. For the scenario, I'm going to choose custom so that I can use a custom recipient, and I'm just going to send an email to myself. So let's say hello, and in the body, let's say test email send. And let's go ahead and click send test email. This should succeed. Now let's go to the inbox for this email address, and you can see that we have a new email at the top, which we sent to ourselves, and it contains the same subject and the content as I entered in the AWS console. Now you can also see that this was sent using AmazonSES.com, and you can also confirm this in the security settings, where you can see that this was mailed by and signed by AmazonSES.com. So we can verify that we are actually able to send email using this address. Let's again jump back to the AWS console. A couple more things you should be aware of if you want to use an email address to verify with SES. If I go to the account dashboard, you can see that we have have some sending limits of 200 emails per 24 hours and a maximum send rate of 1 email per second. This is because we are in a sandbox and we're going to remain in the sandbox until we actually add a domain to verify with SES. This is why I said this was the recommended approach, and you want to take that route for production scenarios. Now, for our intents and purposes, the sandbox environment is going to be more than enough. You can see how many emails you've sent in the daily email usage and how many you have remaining. So how do we actually integrate this into a .NET application? Well, you can take two approaches. One is using SMTP and the other one is using the AWS SDK. I'm going to demonstrate how you could integrate SMTP, and I'm going to show you with a practical example how to use the AWS SDK. So let's go into SMTP settings, which is short for Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. And what you want to do is click Create SMTP Credentials. This is going to take you to another screen. We're going to create a new user with the required credentials and permissions required for sending emails. And then you have to click Create User. This is going to create a user and then give you the SMTP credentials, which you can plug into any SMTP enabled provider and start sending emails. You're going to need the SMTP username and the SMTP password, and you also have to configure a couple more settings, and then you can start manually sending emails using SMTP. While this approach is popular and well known, I think it's much simpler to use the AWS SDK. So I'm going to remove this user and then let's jump into our .NET application to see how we can integrate the AWS SDK. I'll start from a bare bones ASP.NET Core Web API application, and the first thing I want to do is introduce some NuGet packages. So let's browse for the NuGet packages that we want to use, and I'm going to type in AWS SDK and then extensions, and I want to install the AWS SDK extensions net core setup. This is going to make it somewhat simpler for us to use AWS services with dependency injection in ASP.NET Core. Then let's go ahead and look for AWS SDK email. And I want to install the AWS SDK simple email NuGet package. So let's go ahead and install the latest version. So once this completes, we have to wire up a couple of services. So I'm going to close this down. And then in the program file, here's what we want to do. First, I want to say builder services add default AWS options, and we have to provide an actual options object. And we can do this from our configuration settings by saying builder configuration get AWS options. This is going to look for an AWS section in your configuration and use that to configure the default AWS options. What I want to do here is just say AWS and then specify my region, and I'm going to say US East 1, which is where I've configured my Amazon SES identity. So once this is done, we can say builder services add AWS service, and we can register the iAmazon simple email service with dependency injection, and we can start using it inside of our endpoints. Now, to make this a bit more realistic, I'm going to introduce an email settings object, or class to be more precise. So let's call this email settings. I'll make it a public sealed class, and I want it to have one property, which is going to be my default sender email. And let's say it has a default value of string empty. So then I want to have the same configuration section in my application settings. So let's say email settings and then sender email, and then I'm going to paste in the email value that I configured as an identity in Amazon SES. So now I have to wire this up with dependency injection. So I will say builder services configure, specify the email settings object, and then I'll say builder configuration get section, and we have to provide our section name. So let's also do that with a constant. So I'll say public constant string, let's call it configuration section, and I'm just going to use the name of this type as email settings. So then in my program file, I can say email settings configuration section, and then my settings object will be configured with dependency injection. So let's create a post endpoint called email. I'll make it async. And what do we want to have for our dependencies? Well, first I want to accept an email. I'm just going to use a simple query parameter to pass this along. Then I need my iAmazon simple email service. Let's call it the email service. And of course, we need our email settings. So let's also add the settings object. Then, as with most AWS SDK integrations, you need to create a request object. So let's create a new send email request, and then let me show you what you have to provide here. We can set the source. source, which is going to be our settings sender email value. Then we can set the destination object, where we can pass the two addresses in the constructor, or we can initialize this with an empty constructor and then set the two addresses as an array. Now I only have one address where I want to send this to, so it's just going to be the email that I pass in as a query parameter. Then we have to set the message content, so let's initialize a new message, and here we want to set our subject line. I'm going to say new content and specify my subject line. Let's say that this is some sort of welcome email, and I'm going to say welcome to our platform. Now when it comes to the body, you have a couple of options. So I'm going to initialize the body object, and then here you can either set the HTML content or the text content. Now you're going to use HTML if you want to send some rich content, and if you just want to send text content, then go ahead and use that. Now I'm going to use the HTML content, and then here is the actual HTML that I want to use inside of my email. It's just going to be a continuation of what I had in the subject, welcoming a user to our platform, listing out what they can do next, and then telling them that if they have any questions, they can reply to this email. So this is what a typical send email request could look like. Now you can also set the carbon copy addresses or the blank carbon copy addresses in the destination object. So once we have our send email request, what do we do next? Well, we can just say await email service, send email async, pass along the request, and that's it. This is going to reach out to the simple email service API and attempt to send the email. Now we're going to get back a response object, and let's return some sort of result. I'm going to say results okay, and then I'm going to send the response message ID, for example, and the response HTTP status code. Now, one remark, if you want to be running this yourself, is you're going to need to have your AWS credentials available somehow on your local machine. I have this because I logged in using AWS Toolkit in Visual Studio. You can also log in using the AWS CLI, and this is just going to store your credentials in a credentials file on your local system. An alternative is passing these values as environment variables or application secrets. Either way, you will need to authenticate with AWS. Now, if I go ahead and start the application, and I try to send a post request to our API using the minimal API endpoint that I defined, and I specify the email address where I'm just going to be sending this email to myself. Now let's go ahead and send this request, and we're going to hit the breakpoint inside of our minimal API endpoint. You can see that my email service is resolved from dependency injection. For the email settings, I ended up going down the iOptions route to make this work correctly, and you can see that inside of the settings object, our sender email is properly bound from the application settings. Now I can go ahead and create my request object, send the email using the simple email service provided by the AWS SDK, and you can see that this seemingly completes. Let's press continue, and we get a response saying that the HTTP status code is 200 and our message ID is assigned. Now let's jump into our inbox, and you can see that we have a new email with the subject welcome to our platform, and the content inside is HTML. You can tell by the way that the text here is formatted. This is an H1 tag with some bold letters, and then we also have a signature in the end with some lighter colors. Now, what else can we do with the AWS SDK that I think is very interesting to highlight? If your emails are quite similar with each other, what you can do is create an email template. So let me show you how you can do this. I'm going to create a static class which is going to hold my email templates. So let's go ahead and define the email templates class. And let's say I have two email templates, the welcome email template and let's say some newsletter template. I'm going to use two examples to highlight some different capabilities that you can do with Amazon SES templates. Let me drop in a method to initialize our templates, and then I'm going to walk you through what we have inside. So we're going to use the simple email service to reach out to the AWS SES API, and I want to create two templates. For this, we have to initialize a create template request object, and inside of it, you have to set your template. On the template, you can assign it a unique name, which you're going to reference when sending emails using this template. For the subject part, you can make this completely templatized, and how you can substitute values is using two curly braces to represent a parameter. So in my example, in the welcome email, I want to have a username substitute value, and I'm going to specify it like this. I can also use it inside of my text content or HTML content, which you can set using the text part or the HTML part properties. Here I'm going to make the email more personalized by specifying the username as a parameter. And then we have another template, which is going to be our newsletter template. Let's call this our weekly update, where we can assign the title as a parameter. We're going to have an opening line with the username, the newsletter content as a separate parameter, and then we can use this syntax where we can specify an array of arguments, let's call it articles, and by using the hash symbol, you can iterate over this collection and reference the objects using this. Now, this could be complex objects with multiple properties, let's say a title and a description, and you can easily start making dynamic content inside of your templates. To initialize this with SES, I'm first going to delete these templates if they exist by some chance. To do this, you just specify the template name in the delete template request, and then I'm going to send my 2 create template requests using the request objects that I defined above. Let's go ahead and initialize this from our program file. At the start of the program, I'm going to resolve the email service from dependency injection. I'll say builder services get required service, Amazon simple email service. Then I'm going to say await email templates, initialize templates, and let's pass in the email service instance. So let's start the application, and I'm going to place a breakpoint here, and let's see if this is going to work. So we're going to land on our breakpoint, create our 2 objects, delete the templates if they exist by some chance, and then create them. So let me stop this right here and jump into the AWS console. And if I go to the email template section, you can see that our welcome template and newsletter template are successfully created and available inside of the Amazon SES email templates. Now, how do we actually use them to send emails? I'm going to comment out the initialization code. Now, typically, you're going to run this once when you actually set up your templates, or you can have a separate template management service that's going to also take care of updating these templates. Given that we've already created our templates, I'm going to comment this out, and then let me drop in 2 more API endpoints to demonstrate how to use these templates. So the first is going to be our welcome email, and we're going to send this using our welcome email template. So I need to initialize a send templated email request object, very similar to creating a send email request object. I'm going to specify the source using my email settings. The template name is available as a constant. You could also pull this value from your application settings or even a database if you are managing a lot of templates. The destination is going to come from my request parameter, and then the template data has to be a JSON object. I'm going to initialize an anonymous object and serialize this into JSON. And then I just use the Amazon simple email service to send my templated email, and we're going to observe the result. Now, a similar story when using the newsletter template. We initialize the send templated email request object. We specify the sender, the template name, the destination. The template data is a bit more complex in this example, as I have a username, a newsletter title, a newsletter content, an array of articles which I can iterate over to create dynamic content inside of my templates. And each object here is the same with a title and a description. So let's go ahead and save this and start the application, and then let's see if this works. Let's first send a post request to the welcome email endpoint, and you can see that we land on our breakpoint. I'm going to create my send templated email request object, send it, and you can see that this completes. Let me press continue, and we get a response back in Postman. Now let's also send a request to the newsletter endpoint. I'm going to land on the breakpoint, create a request object, send this, and we get a response back. Now let's check out our email inbox. And inside of my inbox, I have 2 emails, and you can see that our parameters are properly substituted in the email content. So we use a template to define what our email should hold, and when we send this, we provide the parameter values, and they are placed in the actual email content that is sent to the user. You can also see that in the dynamic email example, which represents our newsletter, we have our articles which are rendered using a for each loop, where we specify an array of objects and then use them to render the contents of the email. So I don't know about you, but I really appreciate the simplicity of integrating the SES service in a .NET application. All you need is injecting a dependency, creating an email request object, or a templated request object and just sending your email, and all of it just works with minimal setup. You don't need to deal with configuring SMTP servers and making sure that everything is working properly. You can just leverage SES and everything works out of the box. And you also have a lot of flexibility when it comes to how you can send your emails. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to smash the like button right below. If you want to get some free AWS credits, check out the pinned comment right below this video. Thanks a lot for watching, and until next time, stay awesome.